Okay, so we're recording. Welcome to the first lecture of Physics 137. I'm just going to go ahead and share the notes. Okay, so there we go. Okay, so I think many of you are joining us from Physics 136. So if you are, welcome back. I commend you on a very valiant first semester. A 6-week course is an intense course for any subject, but it is specifically very intense for a science course. And there are many other science courses that are offered in the summer, but they're not 6 weeks. They're the normal 12 weeks from May till August. And like chemistry, for instance, their Chem 110 is from January to April, and then their Chem 120 is from May till August. So they don't have a compressed schedule like us. Math does the same thing. They do not have a compressed schedule. So it's a very valiant effort, you know, to take on a physics course. Physics is extra tough because it combines both math and physics, and a lot of people tend to have trouble with math, which is understandable. It's a very prevalent issue, and physics on top of that math is only going to make the issue worse. So to take on a 6-week summer class, whether it be this semester or last semester, is very valiant. So if you are returning, you're a braver person than I am. I was definitely not able to take summer classes in my undergrad. I found it way too much work. So welcome back, and I commend you. If you are new, then we're going to repeat a lot of the information. So I think many of you who are returning are going to be bored for the first maybe 40, 50 minutes, because we're just going to be repeating all the logistics just to make sure everyone's on the same page, because we are going to have visiting students and new students and all this other stuff. So we got to make sure everyone's kind of on the same page. Okay. So, and, oh, the first, okay, welcome to a Microsoft product. Okay, well, the first slide decided to peace out. Okay, so without further ado, let's just get started. I don't want to spend too much time on the course structure, but I will try to say just barely enough to make it coherent, and then we can always look at the video or look at the documents later. So the syllabus or the marking scheme is very similar this semester compared to last semester, with a few very, very minor changes. So we're still going to have pre and post lecture questions. I don't know why that was a typo. It shouldn't say post, it should say pre. I've decided to do away with the post lecture questions. I felt they were too similar to the online assignments. So I didn't feel as though it was like worth having students do both. So we're only going to be doing pre-lecture questions. So if you looked at my announcement, there was some pre-lecture questions for today. I believe there's some for tomorrow as well, but they're all posted online, so you can have a look-see. Just like Physics 136, there's going to be 4 labs. And if you're just joining us this semester, I will try to explain this as best as I can. They are virtual labs, which means you don't actually touch any of the equipment. We're going to have you watch the YouTube video where Gideon, Dan, and or myself will perform the lab and explain the setup. And we will provide you with the lab write-up, which students would normally follow while they're performing their lab in person, but you at least get to see the procedure and see the questions that we've asked students. And the only difference is, instead of performing the actual lab, you're going to be given the data, which I believe is mostly posted already, and you're going to crunch all the numbers. And that's pretty much what you're going to be doing for your lab. You're going to enter your numbers on a worksheet, and the worksheets are mostly final answers only. If you want to sort of show some of your work, we definitely encourage that, but it's not required. And we just want to make sure that, you know, you're kind of following along with the physics ideas, and hopefully final answers only is sufficient. As is usual, you're going to have to do a pre-lab quiz. Most other science disciplines have the notion of pre-labs, and you know, we kind of want to mimic the same experience as we possibly can with an in-person course. So we will still have you guys do pre-labs. Again, they're all posted. The instructions, I think, are very clear. The one major difference between this course historically and this course this summer is that instead of writing a formal lab report, you're going to be writing a formal lab critique. And what that means is we're going to provide you with a sample lab report written by a student, presumably, and you're going to have to act like a TA and mark the lab. So it's kind of new. I know students aren't used to necessarily putting themselves in the teacher's shoes, but I know I found I did my best learning in my undergrad when I had to flip the role. You know, when I had to start helping my friends in a study group or take on more responsibility and help be responsible for someone else's learning. That's when I felt I did the best learning myself. So that's what we're hoping for here, is you're going to read someone else's lab and then mark it. And then your mark on the lab is going to be based on how well you marked the lab. Of course, there's different quality of marking. I mean, that's true with TAs and instructors as well. You could rush the marking and miss some major things, stuff like that. So we're going to be marking you on how well you have marked someone else's lab. So it's kind of meta, very inception-y. As per usual, we're going to have some sort of marks associated with the tutorial. I don't really want to do a formal tutorial quiz. I find those very stressful. You have a 15 or a 20-minute window to write a high pressure quiz. I've never really liked the notion of that. So the virtual tutorial assignments, during your tutorial, you're going to be given a sort of like a worksheet. Part of the tutorial is your TA is going to kind of go through some material with you, some review. They're going to do some sample problems on their iPad or whatever, PowerPoint, whatever they feel fit to do. And then maybe for about 45 minutes or so, you're going to have time to work in small groups on a tutorial worksheet. And the tutorial quiz is going to be merely uploading your solutions in some capacity from that tutorial worksheet. So it's not going to be very high pressure, and they're also a fairly low percentage each. They're only 1% each. So the main goal with the tutorial is not grades. The main goal is for learning and exposure. You'll notice very quickly that in lecture, we do not necessarily have a huge amount of time to devote to doing practice problems, right? That's not the main purpose of a lecture. The main purpose of a lecture is content delivery. And a tutorial is the platform where you're supposed to practice and get your hands dirty. So the learning outcomes of the tutorial are really to just get your hands dirty. So it's important that you show up. It's important you participate and you make an effort. So the marks are there just to make you show up and participate. Please don't think of the tutorial assignments as anything stressful or you need to study for. It's just really to make sure you're showing up. Assignments. So just like in 136, there's going to be 4 assignments. The assignments have 2 parts. There is a handwritten component. That assignment sheet has probably roughly around 4 or 5 questions, give or take, within Epsilon. And the second part of the assignment is the online questions. And the online questions are much easier. They are by no means the same level of difficulty as the handwritten assignments. They're meant to be very conceptual, very quick. Many of them are true and false. A lot of them are multiple choice, and most of them aren't even calculation questions. They're more conceptual. So you could probably get through the online questions fairly quickly. So it's not meant to be daunting. Again, it's meant to be exposure. With physics, the more questions you see and the more situations you're exposed to, the less daunting new problems feel to students. So that's the intent there. As per popular demand, again, I polled everyone in 136. I know some of you voted for one midterm. However, the vote was an overwhelming 80% in favor of having 2 smaller tests. So if you were the 20% that voted for one test, I feel your pain. I mean, I would have been a student myself who would have preferred one test. As an instructor, I prefer one test. It's less work for me to only make one test. But unfortunately, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, as Spock once said. So We're still going to have 2 tests. They're scheduled for Friday, July 24th and Friday, August 7th. The start time is going to be around 8 a.m. Well, it's going to be 8 a.m. tentatively, barring any unforeseen variables. And the reason for this, I know it seems a little bit early for a test, but the reason for this is to accommodate other time zones. For those of you who are west of Toronto, don't worry. I mean, if you are joining me from 136, you know that we will adjust the start time for people west of Toronto. If you're new to 136 and you are west of Toronto, I'm telling you with certainty, don't worry. You will not have to wake up at 5 a.m. to do this midterm. We will accommodate you on that one. But from my experience, very few, relatively, there's about 100 kids in the class. There's only a small handful that are west of Toronto. Most of the time zone issues come from being east of Toronto, like students in Europe or Asia, a few in Africa, stuff like that. So if it's later than 8 a.m., then that's better for, again, most of us. I mean, we're in a weird time, so we can't get perfect. We just have to get the lesser of evils. So anyway, we'll work with that. The small change from last semester, instead of each test being worth 13%, instead of each test being worth 10%, each test is now worth 13%. This was at the expense of reducing the exam. Usually there's a rule at U of T that says exams have to be at least 1/3 of the course, which means 33.3333%. Which means I'm not even allowed to make the exam 33% because that's less than 1/3. So that's why last semester we had it at 34%. And I think the university quickly realized that times are changing. And halfway through 136, they announced that they would allow exceptions to be passed for having exams worth less than 1/3 of the class. Now, they didn't say how much less. I mean, could I have asked for a 5% exam? I probably not, but I think their exact wording was like a reasonable, quote unquote, like a reasonable request. So I don't know how they defined reasonable. I asked for a 28% exam and it was approved. Maybe I could have gotten it down to 25 or 26. I don't know. I didn't want to push my luck, but hopefully you appreciate, it used to be 34%, now it's 28%. So my goal with the syllabus is pretty much reducing the impact of any one piece of evaluation. I'm trying to evenly spread out the marks as much as possible. And then that way, one bad day, one bad test will not significantly negatively impact your performance in the class. So I'm trying to give you lots of opportunities to sort of build up a war fund, so to speak, of grades. So hopefully that plan works. It did last semester. I would say the average last semester, the class average was about a 65, which is, I think it's a few percent higher than it has been in previous summers. I think last summer the average was a 63. So this summer was a 65 and 136. So I'd say we're on track. We're plugging away exactly where we should be. So hopefully you guys appreciate the many opportunities. I know it feels like a lot of work, especially for a 6-week class, but you know, I think it's better than having like a 50% exam, because then one day can really botch your whole course. Okay, moving on to a glimpse at the schedule. So this week it's pretty light, as we did in 136. The first week was sort of easing your way into things. One small change I want to mention from what you guys see on Acorn. Some of you have tutorials on Tuesdays, which is technically today. It makes no sense to have a tutorial today because we would not have covered very much. So I'm shifting the tutorial to Thursday for everybody. So if you have a tutorial on Tuesday, let's say 1 to 3, then that means you have a tutorial on Thursday, 1 to 3. Now, I can understand some of you might have scheduling conflicts with another course. I have manually cross-referenced all of your schedules, so that was a lot of work, but I did it. There's only a small number of you, maybe about 4 or 5 of you out of 100, that are currently enrolled in a Tuesday section that also have a conflict with the Thursday 1 till 3 section. There's only about 4 of you that have that conflict. If you are one of the 4 that have that conflict, you can enroll in the evening tutorial. I believe it's tutorial 105, which is presently labeled as Tuesday 7 till 9 p.m. So if we're switching everything to Thursday, then it'll be Thursday 7 to 9 p.m. And I've double checked the 4 or 5 people that would have a conflict Thursday from 1 till 3 do not have a conflict in the evening. So this shift to Thursday should work for everybody. I think this will make the class run smoother as well, because if you do keep tutorials on Tuesday, then half of you, or more than half of it, it'd be, well, yeah, 2 or 3 tutorials would have been on Tuesday. Half of you would have been receiving a tutorial that has half the information. If we have it on Thursday, then it's after all 3 lectures, and then the TA can summarize all 3 lectures like right away. And I think it's just better for everyone's learning that way. Now, if anyone has any other special circumstances beyond taking a course on Thursday 1 to 3, and you're unable to attend the shifted tutorial on Thursday, please email me, we'll sort it out. But from what I can tell, in terms of school schedules alone, that shift should work with everyone. But of course, some people have jobs, some people, you know, have to babysit their siblings, or, I mean, we're in weird times. So if there's some aspect of that plan that doesn't work with somebody, just please email me and we'll sort it out. The following week is when you quote unquote perform lab 1. So lab 1 will become available in this week right here. I think it'll actually become available Wednesday. And then you will have 1 week to quote unquote do the lab. So you have 1 week to do the pre-quiz. Within that week, not the pre-quiz, the pre-lab, within that week, you have to crunch all the values and complete your worksheet. And within the same week, you have to do your critique. And everybody, every single student, it doesn't matter what practical number you're in, it doesn't matter what tutorial you're in, every single student will submit their lab Wednesdays at, I believe, 11:59 p.m. On Wednesday, everybody. So everyone has the same due date. It was a little bit cumbersome last semester because we had a tumbling due date for people, and that was it was a little bit awkward. So this course, we're just gonna have everyone have it due on the same day. Your first assignment is posted, and it's, again, just like with 136, you've got 2 weeks to do your first assignment, and it's going to be due on the 17th. So there's just that on your radar for you. And then there's our first term test. It's on July 24th. Okay, moving forward, I want to sort of outline, just so we're all clear with the expectations of the course. This is a compressed course. Usually this course is delivered over 12 weeks. We're delivering it over 6 weeks. And yes, that is very tough. It's tough for students, and it's tough for instructors. It's tough for TAs, because we have tight turnaround times. I have to deliver 3 back-to-back lectures. Your TAs have to be constantly marking things, and students have to be constantly studying and constantly doing homework and constantly doing assignments and constantly doing labs. It is stressful for you. It is stressful for everyone. And the only thing I can do about that is acknowledge it. Yes, it is very busy. However, you're going into this class, and I want everyone to be fully aware of what it means. All of us are voluntarily committing to this 6-week course, and we all should be fully aware of the expectations and the time commitments that it's going to have on us. And if you're not able to commit this amount of time each week, I would seriously think if taking the class in the summer is a right decision for you. So let's just kind of briefly break down some of the math here. So as I mentioned, this class is accelerated, so 12 weeks is going to equal 6 weeks. Summer classes are designed for students who have had previous exposure to the material before, at least summer classes that are accelerated. Summer classes that are not accelerated are a normal iteration, but these sort of accelerated courses, like the 6 weeks, they're designed for students who have taken 137 before and for some reason have dropped it and didn't complete their credit. So that's who this course is designed for. Now, if you have no exposure with 137 and you're trying to take it, you're welcome to join us. It'll just be harder because things go very quickly. We're assuming in this class that students have taken this, in some capacity, taken this class before. So if you are doing it fresh, it just means you're going to have more legwork to do. This is the same notion students will have seen sort of in their high school. If you've ever taken summer school from let's say the Peel Boards is where Mississauga, TDSB in Toronto has the same notion. They've got 2 different courses in summer school. If you received a grade of like, 40 to 50, but you didn't quite pass, you can take an accelerated course. And I think it's something like 55 hours. And if you got a grade below 40, they deem that you do not have enough exposure with the material. So then the Peel Board or TDSB will make you take a longer summer course, so like 110 hours. So instead of it being like 3 weeks, it'll be more like 6 weeks for high school. Our courses, there's in university, there's more to our courses. So our compressed course is 6 weeks. So anyway, it mimics kind of what you've seen in high school. On a weekly basis, what you're looking at in terms of time commitment is roughly about 20 to 22 hours a week. And that's only an artifact of the fact that we're accelerated by a factor of 2. So where does that 20, 22 hours a week come from? Well, we've got 6 hours of lecture. You can't avoid that. In my opinion, for every hour of lecture, you should really be spending an hour of studying. And that's actually a conservative number. I tried to do some Googling about this statistic, and the University of Toronto Scarborough campus specifically, they, right on their website, right on Scarborough's website, they have a suggestion for students that for every 1 hour of lecture, students spend 2 hours of studying. And I mean, I don't know, I think that's a little bit excessive, but maybe that's just a blanket number. Maybe that's for any course, whether it be science or English or history or computer science, whatever. Maybe 2 hours is good for any given course. I don't know, but I don't know. I found with my experience being a student, for every 1 hour of lecture, 1 hour of review, combination of review, rereading the lectures, or doing some practice problems, I found that to be a reasonable number. So that's where I'm getting the 6 hours of studying from, because it's 6 hours of lecture. You have 2 hours of tutorial. Again, that's just a time commitment, not necessarily an effort commitment. We're not performing a 3-hour lab anymore, so we're saving those 3 hours, but between the pre-lab, between the worksheet calculations and the lab critique, you should be spending about 3 hours doing all of those things. We've got pre-lecture questions. They're not supposed to be very involved. I post all the lecture slides for you to kind of thumb through. You can use Google when you're doing the pre-lecture questions. They shouldn't take too long. I'm ballparking about 30 minutes total per week. And then assignments, we've got mostly weekly assignments. I mean, we only have 4 assignments, no, 5 assignments, 4 or 5 assignments, I can't remember. And we have 6 weeks. I think we've got 4 assignments in 6 weeks. So it won't be quite 2.5 hours each week for assignments, but it'll be approximate. So you're looking at a time commitment of about 20 to 22 hours a week. And this is on par with a normal course load when it's a non-compressed schedule. So if you're looking at a regular course load in September, you're looking at about 10, 11 hours a week per course anyway. So if you accelerate that by a factor of 2, we're right on par with that. Okay, textbooks. Officially, I'm going to recommend using the Giancoli physics book. I think it's the 7th edition. However, there is no need for you to purchase it. Not only do I think it's possible to find this as a PDF online, although you're going to have to do that on your own. I can't officially tell you to do that. I will also say, however, there is no need to look for the 7th edition specifically. Giancoli is a very old textbook. I think the first edition was back in the 70s. So it's a very well-established book. And even right from the first edition, it was a beautifully written book. And I think the author might still be alive, actually. And so any edition you find, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, any edition you find, whether it be hard copy, soft copy, whatever, is more than sufficient. Any version of this book is amazing. We're not using any features from the publisher, so you don't need MyLabs Plus or Learning Catalytics or whatever. Like you just need the book for reference. If you do need like more explanation or a different explanation, it's good to have that sort of resource. When I say do some practice problems, do some homework after the lecture, again, it's good to have a textbook there. So anyway, that's kind of what I'm recommending. It's optional though. If even a different author altogether, I mean, another famous book is Cutnell and Johnson. That's another really famous book. Yeah, any physics book you can find, really, they're all the same. Okay, trying to breeze right along here. So topics. We have 9 main chapters in this course, and well, I don't want to read them out because that was just boring, but we've got 9 main chapters. I just want to compare that to, for those of you who are joining us for 136, you know what that felt like. I want you to compare that. We had 11 umbrella chapters, but this rotational mechanics was sort of 4 chapters in one, right? Rotational mechanics involved rotational kinematics, rotational energy, rotational dynamics, which is torque, and then angular momentum. So really, we actually had 14 chapters we had to cover in 6 weeks, which is a lot, to say the least. And in 137, we only have 9 chapters to cover in 6 weeks. So we're able to sort of progress a little bit slower. You know, think of the kinematics equations. We've got the same amount of time, but less distance to cover. So our average velocity is lower. So hopefully this course does not feel as much of a sprint. And that's merely an artifact of the fact that the curriculum has fewer chapters to cover. Okay, so course structure, as we've mentioned previously, there's going to be a lab and a tutorial each week. The tutorials are live. You're expected to show up to the tutorials in, well, quote unquote in person, like on your Blackboard Collaborate link. We'll talk about that shortly. Labs, there's nothing to show up to for the lab. It's just a matter of going online and obtaining the information. Most of the time, Fridays are when your assignments are due. I think there's one exception when I think there was a week of a midterm, maybe the second midterm. You have an assignment due on the Sunday just because they don't want you to have an assignment due the evening that you have the midterm. So I think there's only one exception to that. You've got 1 week to perform the labs. We talked about the tutorials already. Pre-lecture questions, we've again briefly talked about this. They're obviously due before the lecture starts, right? That's the whole notion of a pre-lecture question. They're not meant to be stressful. They're weighted very small. Please don't stress about the grade. The whole point of the pre-lecture question is to get your brain engaged in what we will be talking about ahead of time. My biggest pet peeve as a teacher are passive students. What do I mean by passive students? Students who just show up and say, tell me what you want me to know and I'll memorize it. Well, that's not learning. That's not why we're here. My whole job as an educator is to teach you, not just spoon feed you information for you to regurgitate back to me on command. So this whole process, this whole class, and for the pre-lecture questions, everything I do is to sort of get your brain actually engaged in the learning process. So all I'm doing with the pre-lecture questions is I want you to have some sort of notion of what we're going to be talking about in the upcoming lecture. And then hopefully that makes your brain better primed to receive new information. That's all we're doing here with the pre-lecture questions. So please don't stress out about them. If you get a few of them wrong here and there, it's not a big deal. I just want you to be exposed to some of the topics in advance. Labs, I don't want to dwell on the labs. The instructions for the labs are fairly self-explanatory when you go to look at the labs online. So I don't want to dwell on this too much, but just to make sure we're all clear, the main point on this slide are the last 3 bullets. There will be worksheets that you have to complete with mostly final answers only. There's a critique that you have to do, which we've talked about, and they're due on Wednesdays at 11:59 p.m. for everybody. Okay, in terms of the lab critique, again, this is being copied over from 136. If you go to modules, laboratory, you're going to see lab guidelines, And there's going to be 2 documents there. One of the documents is going to explain to students what we expect in a formal scientific report. So this is the same expectations that we're giving the students who wrote these supposed labs. And you can use this document to sort of get a sense of what you're looking for when you're critiquing the lab. You'll notice that in the formal lab guidelines, we don't emphasize format or grammar a lot. I mean, they're important, but they're not detrimental. I was looking at sort of the submissions last semester from 136 from the critiques, and students were really focusing on small things, indenting, bolding, you know, font size. That's important, I suppose, if you're publishing, you know, it has to look pretty. But for a first-year lab, we're far from publishing, right? I mean, you publish when you're a professor and, you know, whatever. So you're far ways away from publishing. Although those formatting things are important, in first year, we're mostly concerned about structure. Is your analysis correct? The physics that the student is describing, does it make sense? Are their explanations correct for the evidence that they're seeing? Are they interpreting the data correctly? Right? Those are sort of the things that we are mostly looking for when we mark labs. So now that we're sort of switching the roles on you, those are the sorts of things we want you to be looking for. So the formal lab guidelines document, they really help to explain to students, to you guys, the core qualities you should be looking for in a formal lab report. So, you know, do the students just regurgitate graph after graph after graph? Because that's not an analysis, that's just displaying data. Or does the student display one graph and then spend 1 or 2 paragraphs talking about and analyzing that graph? That is an analysis, right? That's mostly what we're looking for from you guys. So have a look at that that document to help you with that. We've also provided you with a formal lab example, not from Physics 136 nor Physics 137. It is something from a different physics class altogether, but it's easily readable. I think it's approachable by first years very easily. There are mistakes in that lab on purpose. So if you were to read this formal lab example right here, if it were to be marked, it would be given around an 8 or an 8.5. So if you're trying to, you know, if you're doing the lab critique and you're wondering, oh yeah, this student, you know, I feel as though it's like a 3 or 4, you know, maybe have a look at the formal lab example, this PDF here, and compare it. And if the lab that you're critiquing, that you think is a 3 or a 4, reads very similarly to the one that we've given you as an example, and I'm telling you the one we give you is around an 8, maybe that tells you, oh, hey, look, maybe I'm being way too strict. Maybe I'm nitpicking grammar or format too much. So I don't know, that's why we give you an example to sort of benchmark what we mean is like an A-, which would be about an 8. Tutorials, you attend tutorials online, so you'd go onto Blackboard Collaborate. You can find that button on the side of your menu bar there, and just pick whatever tutorial you're enrolled in. As I've mentioned, all the tutorials are going to be shifted to Thursday. This will not be reflected on Acorn. This is just something we're doing kind of internally. So please, on Thursday, jump into the tutorial that you're registered in, whether it be tutorial 1, 3, 4, or 5. And again, I mentioned earlier, if you are one of the people who have a conflict with Thursday 1 to 3 and weirdly 7 till 9, please email me and we'll sort it out. Yeah, this is me mentioning here. So even though Acorn says Tuesday, 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 we're switching it to Thursday, Thursday, Thursday. So that's just kind of what I'm talking about there. Okay, assignments we already talked about. There's 2 parts, there's a handwritten and an online component. You're submitting the handwritten component digitally, so you're either taking pictures with your cell phone or using a multi-purpose scanner, fax, or printer to digitize them, however you see fit, and you're going to upload as a PDF on Canvas. Oh, this is very important. So last semester, we had a lot of issues with due dates. A little bit surprising, to be honest, because normally with in-person classes, due dates aren't normally an issue. Things are due at the beginning of a lab, or things are due at the beginning of a tutorial. Students come in, hand it in, and then it's in. I don't know. I can understand. I mean, I would probably do this too. You know, the rare event something might happen and you might have to submit like a few minutes past the due date. Usually that's fine. But last semester, for some reason, we had a handful of students who were trying to submit like hours past the due date. I'm not sure why. Due dates are important. I know this is an online class. I know we're in weird sort of events right now, but that due dates are still due dates. You know, unless it's a very, very, very special circumstance, I would have to remind you that due dates are still important. And the other thing I would want to clarify is a computer is blind. So if you submit 1 second late, as far as the computer is concerned, it's mathematically late. That's not me imposing restrictions on you. That's not me being malicious. That's the computer being dumb. You know, in real life, if you're a second late or a few minutes late, yeah, who cares, right? That's what a human brain would tell us. But if you do submit something and it's, you know, 1 or 2 minutes late and it marks it as a 0 because it's late, please don't take it personally. It's just the computer doing its job. Send me an email and just say, you know, hi Mark, my bad, it was a little bit late. I take full responsibility, but seeing as how it's only a few minutes late, you know, would you mind if it wasn't marked late? And my response would be, yeah, of course, it's stupid computers are blind, you know? So please don't take things like that personally, because it's not me doing it, it's just the computer being blind. Midterms, again, I don't really want to rehash this, but the info is there. Okay, so we're right near the end of the intro. It took almost exactly as long as I wanted. Yes, I can, after everything I've just said, you might be feeling daunted, especially if you're coming in from 136, you're kind of predisposed to being traumatized. I can fully appreciate that sentiment. If you are feeling at any point in time during this course that you need help, there is lots of help available. I tried to make this abundantly clear in Physics 136, and many of you actually reached out, which was amazing. I understand that there was a group. I mean, there were students who didn't reach out for whatever reason. It's impossible for me to know why they didn't reach out, but I want to make it very clear to everyone that all you need to do is reach out. Even in-person classes, when we're not during COVID time and we're not online, office hours historically are very poorly attended anyway. So even when we're not online, students don't tend to really seek help in person. That's what I've noticed. I think your TAs will verify that. Historically, when TAs have office hours, no one shows up to their office hours in person either. Historically, I found students usually reach out, even when we're not online, they usually reach out via email first. So hopefully I can sort of convince you that in terms of support, we're not in that different of a scenario now compared to what we used to be. Seeing as how the pattern historically seems to have been students reach out via email first anyway. So I see no reason to sort of change that up. If you ever find yourself stressed or daunted by the work, or you have identified that you are struggling with a particular concept or chapter, all you need to do is reach out. I encourage you to reach out to your TAs first, just because they're responsible for a fewer number of students, you know, so they can, is one TA for 20 students, whereas I'm one instructor for 100 students. So they can probably get to your email faster than I can. So reach out to your TA first if it's for physics, like I don't understand circular motion, or I don't understand conductivity or electric fields, or blah, 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 blah. Hopefully your TA can help you better then, because it's a smaller ratio. And when you're asking for help, you can send an email if it's something quick. You can send an email with a picture of your solution and say like, oh, I'm unsure about this step here, and you can draw an arrow. And then if it's something that's easily sorted over an email, then that's that. If it's something more complicated, like I'm having trouble understanding a certain concept, then maybe you can book a one-on-one Zoom meeting with your TA, or Blackboard Collaborate meeting with your TA. And you can send them an email saying, you know, I would like to work through a question or two with you. You know, would you mind booking a time of 10, 15 minutes with me on Zoom or online to go through? And then you can use the whiteboard on Zoom. You can share the whiteboard and draw things. It's easier to talk verbally when you're talking through some things as well. So there's lots of help out there for you. You just have to reach out. And again, for those of you who did reach out last semester, I think you can confirm that you know, we do try our best to sort of drop what we're doing and try to help you. And you know, we've never cut students off. We've never said, oh, my office hours are up, so goodbye. You know, we always do try to say, however many of you there are that happens to need help, we do try to make time for everyone. I've never turned anyone away for extra help. So I'm just trying to say, if you are feeling stressed or daunted, please just reach out. Oh yeah, me, if you ever need to reach me, you can always ask me physics questions as well. I just think your TAs have fewer students, so it might be wise to email your TAs first. But if it's something like course related, like the structure of the class, logistics, something about the test or the exam, or if there's a concern that you have that you know your TAs aren't going to be able to handle, you know, stuff like that, then you can just email me directly. Pretty much I'm saying whatever your email, whatever your TAs can't handle, you know, obviously just email me and I'll try to sort it out for you. Okay, academic honesty. I gave this sort of exact slide in 136. It didn't seem to go over very well. There were a lot of academic offense cases that were flagged in 136, and I'm still going through a lot of the data. There were just a lot of them to go through. I can't stress this enough. Okay, we're all here to learn. We're all here to get trained. All right. What is the point of education? It's not to just memorize and regurgitate and get an 80 and move on. If that was the case, why are any of us here, right? The whole point of education is to acquire new skills, to get trained in a subject that you will need for your career. You know, if you get into the workplace and you know you get hired because you claim to be, you know, a specialist in whatever field you happen to graduate in, and you know 6 months after your degree you forget everything, then what's the point? You've just wasted $40,000, and then your boss is going to quickly find out you don't know anything and then fire you, and you're going to be left with nothing. Right? The whole point of academia, the whole point of education, is to instill new ideas, problem-solving skills into students, and then that way when students graduate and become functioning members of society in the workforce, you're competent, right? You can actually do the work better than the next guy, so you get to keep your job and excel. If you're trying to Google solutions online or get solutions from a friend in a group chat, you're not doing anyone any favors. And in addition to all of that, if we catch you, that's not going to be good for you. You have a permanent mark on your transcript, which means if you're applying to grad school or specialty programs, they will see that. Even if it's your first offense, they will see that. And if it's a limited enrollment program, they're going to want the best of the best. And if they see a mark on your transcript that you were convicted of an academic offense, they're probably not going to like that. The other thing is that aside, there are some pretty negative consequences for students, all of which are out of my hands completely. All my role in this is if something gets flagged, it immediately gets put onto the chair of the department and the dean. They investigate, they impose sanctions. As soon as something gets flagged, it is completely out of the instructor's hands completely. So I have no ability to sort of swoop in and even try to save you. All I do is I deliver the evidence to the chair of the department, and then they make all the decisions. So, you know, sanctions are pretty, some common sanction is a 0 on the piece of evaluation that we're talking about. So if it's the exam, for instance, or the midterm, you've just lost 13 or 28%, just snap of your hand, gone. If it's a more serious offense, like, you know, you were the one who initiated and you posted the solutions, or you posted the question online for people to answer, that's a more serious offense. Then other more serious consequences would be an immediate 0 in the course, just immediately. If something minor would be someone else posted the questions and you just happened to view the solutions. Again, not great, but it is not as bad as posting them and asking someone to solve them, right? So the consequences are immediately fairly bad. The future consequences, I think, are even worse, because that mark will be on your transcript forever. So please think twice before, you know, committing any academic offenses. It's not a good situation for anyone. Here, I will try to outline, a lot of students last semester were saying, well, I didn't know something was an academic offense. I personally find that hard to believe. I think if you're paying for solutions to a marked piece of evaluation, you must realize that that's not okay. But for the sake of completeness, I will say with clarity, what is an academic offense? Essentially, claiming that something is your work when it is not. Anything that falls under that umbrella is an academic offense. So if you do the assignment, for instance, and you're unsure of your answers, so you go online to Google the question and you compare the online, let's say you do find it online, and you compare the solution online with your solution. That's still plagiarism. Even if you got the question right to begin with, that's still plagiarism, because you were unsure of your answer, and instead of submitting your work as it was, accepting any responsibility for any flaw in your work because it was your own work, you decided to verify it ahead of time before submitting it. That means that all of a sudden, as soon as you verified against a solution online, that means it is now no longer your work. It has been verified by someone else. And then when you submit it, that becomes not solely your work. It's worse if you just are confused with the question and you have not even attempted it, and you just copy blindly from a solution online. Then it's demonstrably not your work. Even sharing answers. If you solve the problem and you give your answer, and let's say you are confident in your answer, if you give your solution to someone else, that is also an academic offense, because you're helping someone else cheat, right? So it takes two to tango. So I cannot stress this enough. The rules on academic integrity are fairly clear. They're well documented on any of the U of T websites. So whether it be St. George or Scarborough or UTM, whatever campus you happen to be from, by all means, look them up either on the UTM page or on your own campus's page. They're fairly straightforward. So I can only encourage us moving forward to try to do this class honestly. If you are finding, like I said, I will kind of refer you back up to here. If you are finding like you need help, this is your time to ask, right? Miss Frizzle used to say, I don't know if anyone is familiar with the Magic School Bus, but this is your time in a first-year physics class to take chances, make mistakes, and get messy, right? You are in an environment that we allow you to make mistakes. That's the whole point of education, is if you don't make mistakes, you don't learn. So now that you're here in this sort of construct where you're allowed to make mistakes, embrace it. If you are confused, email us for clarification. You will learn and feel so much more rewarded at the end of the class if you actually come out of the class learning something than if you just blindly go online and copy solutions. Because then you're not going to feel like you learned anything. You're just going to feel frustrated because the assignments are hard, and then we're going to catch you cheating, and then you're going to feel more frustrated. So it's a bad feedback loop to be in. If you want to break that cycle, just email us for extra help, your TAs or me, and we will be more than happy to help you. And then once you learn something and you get that sort of light bulb moment, you will feel good. Trust me, I've been there. I've seen students have the light bulb moment. It is a much better experience when you strive to learn instead of strive to memorize. Okay, I'm going to take a pause before moving on to the actual material. Are there any questions? I'm going to open the chat now. If there's any questions about anything I just talked about, I will see them now in the chat, and I'll be able to sort of answer them. Will these recordings be available for all of us? Yes. Sorry, you're right. I did forget to mention that. So I will post these recordings on a YouTube channel. For those of you who are joining us from 136, you already know that. So I guess since you're asking, I'm going to assume you're not from 136. Yeah, they will all be publicly available on YouTube. I will post the link to the YouTube channel later today once the video recordings are ready. I will strongly recommend, though, if you are at an appropriate time zone to attend these lectures live, please do. It's a very steep slope. It's not even a slippery slope. It's very steep. Say, oh yeah, you know, I'm in Toronto. I could easily attend the lectures live, but I'll just watch them later on YouTube. Life takes over. You get lazy. I mean, I'm a very lazy person. Like, I've never been to the gym. So when you allow yourself the freedom, often you end up hanging yourself with the rope that you've given yourself. I do that all the time with me and my own, you know, stuff. And I've seen it all the time with students as well. So the sort of schedule helps keep you focused and helps keep you on track. So if you are able to show up to the live lectures, I strongly, strongly recommend that. Okay, thank you for the feedback, Rodrigo. Thank you. I appreciate the words. Anything else? Any other questions before we start the lecture? You're welcome, William. Okay, if there's nothing further, I very much appreciate your supportive words, everyone. If there's nothing further, I think we can jump right into actual course material. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to close the chat now. So Romina, oh, I forgot to introduce Romina. Oh, wow. So 136, we had a few TAs who were attending the lecture with us to help handle the answers, your questions in the group chat. We had Brandon and Oksana last semester. This semester, we have Romina, whom you might remember from being one of the TAs last semester. Some of you might even have Romina this semester as a TA. We haven't assigned tutorials yet for the TAs, but she will be one of them. So, and all 3 days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, we will have Romina joining us during the lecture. So as I'm teaching, if you guys have any questions about things that I've said or clarifications, by all means, shoot them off in the chat. And Romina, being a fellow expert in physics, she'll be able to address your questions. And then that way, that helps kind of make the lecture more smooth. That way I'm not always pausing and interrupting the flow of the lecture. So hopefully you make good use of her. It's very early for her. She's not a morning person. And I'm sure she's sitting there with like multiple cups of coffee in her hand. And she's probably even giggling at the moment that I even mentioned that.
Absolutely.
See, told you.
Called it.
Anyway.
I'm to you a little bit though. I somehow have a UBC mug at home, so I don't know where.
I don't know. UBC's. I visited the UBC campus a few years ago, and it's a beautiful campus. Absolutely gorgeous. I've got nothing against UBC.
Yeah.
Actually, Romina, do you remember Nicole Prent? No, she may have been before your time. Nicole Prent was kind of like me, but before me. She was an amazing TA, and she's now at UBC, I believe.
Ah, so, cool.
Yeah, I've got nothing against UBC. They're an amazing school. Anyway, without further ado, if there's no other questions, I'm gonna stop the lecture recording and put this as a separate video because this is more so course introduction. And then I'm gonna resume the lecture recording for the first part of the actual lecture content and then as a separate video. So if you're joining us on YouTube later, we're only gonna be a few seconds later in real life, but it'll be a completely different video for you. Okay, see you in the next video.